Welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name's Dana Allen. I'm a senior fellow here and editor of Survival. The title of our talk tonight is The Future of Iraq and the Fight Against ISIS. And we couldn't possibly, I think, have a better and more astute expert to address this question. Toby Dodge is the Kuwait Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics. He's also director of the Middle East Center at the LSE. For, I think, 10 years or more, he's been a consulting senior fellow here at the IISS. And he has been really a mainstay of this institute on Middle East issues in general and Iraq in particular, going back, I guess it's more than 10 years now that I think about it, because going back to before the Iraq War. His most recent book on Iraq specifically was an IISS book, which I hold in my hand, Iraq from War to a New Authoritarianism, which was listed as it was published in 2012, was listed by The Economist as it was reviewed exuberantly in The Economist, and listed as one of The Economist's notable books of that year. The review described it as a tale worthy of Shakespeare, which I can't really believe, but there you are. You know, I think the important thing is that the analysis in this book really forensically cut to the political problem that I think Toby is going to continue to talk about tonight. It also, by the way, elicited from Prime Minister Maliki the statement that if he went back to Iraq, he would never return. So, have you been back to Iraq since then?
I haven't actually. I took his advice. So.
Okay. Toby is going to speak for about half an hour, and then we're going to have a discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Dana, and thank you for all coming this evening. It's a pleasure to see so many old friends from academia, from journalism, from business, and indeed from the IISS itself. I hope you've made use of the very generous IISS wine supplied before the talk this evening, because I think you're probably going to need it. There isn't going to be a lot of sunshine and happiness in this talk, which kind of gives you a hint of the bleak description and analysis of Iraqi politics and the movement forward that I'm going to give. But as a taster, I want to cover four big themes this evening. Firstly, to recap on what you probably all know, but I think it's worth going over, the Islamic State or Daesh's growth, and explain why it's managed to accelerate into such a major position in both Iraq and Syria. I then want to look almost at the opposite, the United States, the Iraqi government, and their allies on the ground's attempts to contain and shrink Daesh. And to be frank, it's not gone well. Thirdly, we need to explain why that is, and I think that's the dynamics at the center of Iraqi politics in Baghdad and indeed Erbil, before concluding with some thoughts on the future of Iraq and where the polity may or may not be going. So just to recap why we're all here, why there's such a pleasantly large audience, Iraq's current crisis, the last of a number, engulfed the country on the 10th of June last year when forces loyal to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant or Daesh seized Mosul, then the country's second largest city. Now, the result of this crisis can be seen in UN estimates across 2014 that nearly 12,500 people died in Iraq. Now, in the 8 months between January 2015 and August this year, nearly 8,200 people have been killed. So these figures represent a 5-year high. Iraq, I would argue, is certainly back in the midst of a civil war that, if anything, the destabilizing dynamics are spreading. Now, again, as we know, after the seizure of Mosul, Daesh's highly motivated and mobile forces exploited popular discontent amongst Iraq's Sunni minority population to sweep southwards towards Baghdad, with their advance only being halted at Samarra, a little over 100 kilometers short of the capital. With their advance southward halted, again showing their mobility, in early August 2014, they redeployed their troops, pushing into Jebel Sinjar, a region of northwest Iraq along the Syrian border, dominated by the Yezidi minority, forcing over 130,000 people to flee into Kurdish territory. They then advanced towards the capital city of the Kurdish Regional Government, Erbil, overrunning the Peshmerga forces, defending the city's outskirts. It was these two instances, the threat to Erbil and the activity in Jebel Sinjar, that finally triggered US intervention. The 8th of August saw President Obama authorize the use of American air power against Daesh. Now, however, in spite of a change of Prime Minister in Baghdad in August 2014 and the extensive air campaign against them, I think we can see that campaign as having reached a stalemate, with only 10% of the territory that Daesh was holding at the high point of its campaign being taken back from them. Now, what I'd argue here, and the underpinning theme of the whole talk, is the continued resilience of Daesh in the face of extended US-led multilateral air campaign, indicates that they are nothing more, albeit a very tenacious and egregious symptom, a violent symptom of much larger structural problems that have underpinned Iraq since regime change in 2003. Now, these problems are largely political. They drove Iraq into civil war 2004, 2006, and sadly, they weren't solved by the US-led surge of 2007-10. For Iraq to be stabilized, I want to argue tonight, for Iraq to be brought back together, it's these political problems that have to be solved. And in debates around that, I see no evidence that there is a policy to do that. Yes, there will be yet another push on Daesh. Yes, I think we're going to see yet again another extended US commitment in the territory of Iraq. But until these underlying structural problems are sorted out, I don't think Iraq will have much future at all. So against that background, let's review Daesh's birth and its evolution. And of course, this long predates the seizure of Mosul, and it long predates Daesh's entry into the Syrian civil war. Now, an educated audience like this will know that, but as we skim through press reports over the last 12 months to a year and a half, Daesh seems to be a new phenomenon that's grabbed hold of Syria and Iraq. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of history. If there was, we would know that the Islamic State in Iraq was actually created in 2006 at the height of Iraq's bloody civil war. As a radical Sunni jihadi organization, it was designed ideologically as well as organizationally to capitalize on an increasingly sectarian conflict in Iraq, and Daesh bears all the brutal hallmarks of that war's horror. Given the circumstances of its creation, Daesh's ideology has evolved to become even more hardline and even more brutal than its forerunner, al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. Now, in contrast to al-Qaeda, it is totally uncompromising on doctrinal issues, demanding complete adherence to its interpretation of Islam. Only its own members are seen to be true Muslims, and as so, they must disassociate themselves from all Muslims, other Muslims who are seen as unbelievers. The failure to rule in accordance with Daesh's interpretation of God's law constitutes unbelief. Opposing the Islamic State is tantamount hence to apostasy, and both are punishable by death. Finally, all Shia Muslims are apostates, deserving of death. Now, if you look at Daesh's rather thin and austere jurisprudence, its Islamic philosophy, you see its birth in Iraq at the height of that sectarian civil war. You could argue its main reason for being, its driving understanding that cemented its central role in Iraq is its sectarian ideology, its clear and unambiguous hatred of Shia Islam. In 2007, the Islamic State, along with the radical Shia militias, became the main target of the US-led surge of troops into Iraq. By the time that its current leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, took over the organization in 2010, the US had succeeded in reducing its number of active members to the low hundreds. So again, keep this in mind, militarily, the surge was very successful. However, Daesh's renewal was driven by three separate and interlinked dynamics. Firstly, having failed to renegotiate, this is fairly predictable, we'll carry on. If you want to ask questions about who lost Iraq, whether it was Bush or Obama, I'm more than happy to engage in that debate, but that's probably outside the fringes of this specific talk. Having failed to renegotiate the follow-on status of forces agreement, all US military forces were withdrawn from the country at the end of December 2011. This left the US precious little diplomatic influence over Nouri al-Maliki's government in Baghdad. Secondly, Iraq's prime minister from 2006 to 2014, I don't think he actually read the book, but he was very disturbed by the cover, which I thought was rather mischievous, but it shows Nouri al-Maliki on the cover with Saddam Hussein overlooking his shoulder. It's actually a homage to a previous history of Iraq that had King Faisal looking over the shoulder of Saddam Hussein, but he didn't get the historical reference and got rather grumpy about it. But we won't go there, it doesn't matter. Nouri al-Maliki's greater blame, apart from not reading my book, is that he repeatedly tried to bolster his own electoral legitimacy and solidify his vote amongst the Shia majority by demonizing Iraq's Sunnis, firstly associating them with the Ba'athist regime generally, and then claiming that they were the lifeblood behind the civil war and the increasingly Sunni Islamic extremist insurgency that followed. Obviously, this approach reached its peak when the popular and effective Minister of Finance, Rafi al-Asawi, a Sunni member of the Iraqi political bloc, was driven from the cabinet in 2013 on trumped-up charges of terrorism. So you have these two dynamics unfolding, the rapid reduction of American influence and then stepping into that vacuum, using new autonomy and indeed using the security forces that the Americans had bequeathed him, Nouri al-Maliki driving an overt sectarian agenda. Finally, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi skillfully led Daesh's rejuvenation by launching a series of very effective military campaigns to seize back territory vacated by the departing American troops, while also capitalizing on the increasing sense of alienation and persecution, justifiably in this case, felt by Iraq's Sunnis. In 2012, al-Baghdadi launched what amounted to a hostile takeover of the Syrian radical jihad against Assad, using his battle-hardened forces to take territory and hence gain control over new fighters and resources then flowing into Syria. Baghdadi's commitment to both the civil war in Syria and the campaign in Iraq was symbolized in April 2013 when, for the second time, he renamed the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. The rebranding of Daesh as simply the Islamic State after he seized Mosul in June 2014 indicated yet another expansion of the organization's ambition. The declaration of a universal Muslim caliphate with the appointment of al-Baghdadi, self-appointment we may suggest, as caliph, is indicative of Daesh's offensive jihad, its recognition as a central trait of both its strategy and its ideology that to survive it needs to continually expand the territory and the population that it controls. And again, we can talk in debate afterwards about how its international strategies have evolved, and indeed the increasing international threat that its own strategic understanding poses to Europe and indeed Britain. Now, the surprising success of Daesh's campaign in Iraq has certainly attracted new recruits into its ranks. In September 2014, the CIA estimated that it could mobilize between 20 and 31,500 fighters, both across Iraq and in Syria. In spite of its hardline ideology, Daesh's recruiting strategies is surprisingly pragmatic. I would argue that a large majority of its fighters remain Iraqi and Syrian, and the vast majority of its senior commanders are still Iraqi, with notably the mid-ranks of its organization, if you want, its technocratic purveyors of violence coming from the mid-levels of Saddam Hussein's military and intelligence service. Now, this isn't an argument to say that somehow the Ba'ath has evolved into a radical Islamist organization. It is to say that pragmatic members trained in violence and repression from Saddam Hussein's state, as once the state has collapsed and scattered, sold their skills to the highest or the most successful bidder, which happened in this case to be Daesh. So the majority of its rank and file are made up of local fighters who have entered its ranks either because of anger with the governments either in Baghdad or Damascus, for different reasons obviously, or because they defected from other less successful jihadi groups. Now, the organization's finances have certainly been damaged by post-August 2014 attacks on Daesh's oil wells around Raqqa and Syria. Estimates suggest that daily oil revenues may have been reduced from a high of $1 or $2 million a day to as little as $300,000 a day in 2015. However, a report released by the Financial Action Task Force in February 2015 argues that the majority of Daesh's finance is still extracted from the territories they control through through taxes from business, fees for government services, or taxes on the goods moved in and out of its territory. This all goes to pay for the estimated monthly wage bill of $10 million to keep its fighters in the field. What that's there for is to suggest that the argument that there was an easy solution to Daesh's control, simply hitting the oil wells or constraining its ability to sell oil on, I think is somewhat naive. Now, the launch of the US-led air campaign against Daesh in August 2014 undoubtedly broke its previous momentum and played a key role in ending the siege of the Syrian Kurdish town of Kobani. It also engendered a deal of optimism, could we say, if not hubris, both in the Pentagon and the Iraqi military. So in January 2015, the Pentagon, with a great deal of drums and hurrah, announced that Daesh had lost 700 square kilometers of its territory in the first 4 months of the campaign. In mid-April, the US military increased this figure, claiming that Daesh had now lost control over nearly 15,500 square kilometers. More recent estimates, more modest estimates, more grounded, I suggest, estimates, would say that it's probably lost little more than 10% of the territory that it originally held. Now, the reason for this we'll get to. I think if we look at what happened in Iraq in June 2014 onwards, the collapse of the Iraqi military led to the creation of the Popular Mobilisation Forces, basically an ad hoc militia that drew in thousands and thousands of young men worried about the fall of Baghdad. It's this force that has been the striking force in the retaking of Tikrit, which began in March 2015. Now, there were 27,000 troops involved in that campaign, labelled government forces, but actually 70% of that force was Shia militias. In addition, two gentlemen that were reported to play a key role in that retaking were Qasem Soleimani and Hadi al-Amri. As we know, Qasem Soleimani is the head of the Quds Brigade of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and Hadi al-Amri is a senior commander in the Iraqi militia, the Badr Brigade, which were a key player in the violent civil war that ripped Iraq apart from 2004 through to 2007. So the campaign to retake Tikrit saw militias primarily mobilized by sectarian Shia identity join with the US Air Force in a 29-day campaign to seize the town or the city. Now, again, I think the new Prime Minister, Hadi al-Amri, was very astute to pull these popular mobilization brigades out of Tikrit once they'd seized the city. But I think that didn't reduce the fear of the indigenous population of Tikrit that they were going to be subject to retaliations, and so you have mass movements of populations. Now, again, that renewed sense of optimism that the siege of Tikrit engendered within the forces fighting Daesh was short-lived, with Daesh's ability to quickly regroup in the face of territorial defeat, and then seize Ramadi, the provincial capital of Anbar. Now that operation was extremely well planned, using heavy lifting material, bulldozers, and suicide bombings, and it triggered the US Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, to suggest that the Iraqi army had lost the city, quote, because Iraqi forces showed no will to fight. This conclusion was especially damning when it emerged that Iraq's elite Golden Division, the counterterrorism troops, were amongst those who fled the capital in the face of Daesh's advance. Now, the campaign to retake Ramadi has started in mid-July, but has yet to show any sustainable sense of headway. Now, to conclude this section about the campaign, in spite of over 4,000 airstrikes in Iraq over the past year, and the US spending roughly $10 million a day, I would agree with the incoming Commandant of the US Marines, Lieutenant General Robert Neller, that what we see is a stalemate. That this current tactic of air campaign and local allies, because of who the local allies are, isn't working. Now, Ashton Carter's derogatory remarks about the Iraqi army highlighted probably the lack of credibility about US plans to base the defeat of Daesh on the rebuilt Iraqi forces. Now, let's go back to 2004 to 2011. The US government spent nearly $25 billion on trying to rebuild the Iraqi armed forces. In January 2012, those armed forces employed nearly 1 million people, 933,000, split between the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior and the counterterrorism force controlled by the Prime Minister. The majority of this force, carefully constructed over 7 years, with a lot of US training and investment of vast amounts of money, collapsed in 2014 in the face of Daesh's campaign to take Mosul and beyond. Now, in the face of that, what possible chance has the US got of, with a much smaller commitment of resources, of trainers, and time in rebuilding the Iraqi army to be a fighting force? I have profound doubts about that, and that brings us back to what I've titled the problem of the militias. So that if you think about what the surge successfully did from 2007 onwards, is to target both the radical Sunni Islamist forces around al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, but also a large chunk of the Shia militias. This reaches its peak in 2008 when Nouri al-Maliki launches the charge of the Knights against the Sadrist forces in Basra. The militias were shrunk, contained, and largely pushed off the streets of Iraq's capital. Tragically, I think, but for very good reason, on the 13th of June 2014, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, Iraq's most senior religious authority and probably the holder of the vast majority of legitimacy within Iraq, issued a fatwa calling for all able-bodied men to defend their country and their people and their holy places. Now, although Sistani's fatwa explicitly asked for volunteers to join Iraqi government forces, and the government itself quickly set up organizations to try and control them, that call, the thousands of people that moved in that mobilized, the vast majority of them were picked up by Shia militias. And what we've then seen is the metasizing of radically sectarian militias, organizations like Asib al-Haq, Katib al-Hezbollah, and the Badr Brigade, picking up on the fear of the population of Baghdad, picking up on Sistani's fatwa, and metasizing their own capacity, metasizing the territory that they control, and becoming the striking force against Daesh in the north. And I think that's a real problem, and I think that's the legacy of last summer that haunts Iraq. Now, in the last couple of minutes, let me try and focus on some good news. I think the turmoil and fear engendered by the fall of Mosul did deliver one positive, and that's the removal of Nouri al-Maliki as Prime Minister and his replacement by Haider al-Abadi. Now, this in itself brings problems. In the April 2014 national elections, Maliki himself won the highest personal backing of any Iraqi politician, scoring 721,000 votes. This means Haider al-Abadi, catapulted into power in the aftermath of an election that Maliki's coalition state of law clearly did very well in, has a legitimacy problem straight from the beginning. Now, Abadi's problems are multifaceted. He's inherited a collapsed state, incredibly weak civil institutions, and a legitimacy deficit. The first real problem that he's faced is this summer. Demonstrations in Baghdad and across the south called for an end to corruption, but also, more intriguingly, an end to the Mahassa system, this sectarian quota system that has formed every government of national unity since 2005. Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani supported this process in the first week of August, saying that the government had to step away from corruption, rebuild its relationship and its legitimacy with the Iraqi population. Abadi very quickly responded a couple of days after Sistani's edict with a 9-point plan of reform. And this is the first time in a long time that I've actually been optimistic about Iraqi politics, because Abadi, with I think a great deal of courage, identified the underlying structural problems that have undermined Iraq since at least 2003. Firstly, he vowed to reform the judiciary. Secondly, he vowed to set up a national commission to eliminate corruption. He then shrunk his cabinet from 33 members to 22 members, took away a large amount of their security detail, and vowed to end the sectarian apportionment for government ministries. And he also abolished the deputy president's position. Now, you could argue this is a huge step in the right direction, and you could argue this is positive because it went through Parliament very, very quickly. However, when you look at Abadi's new government more carefully, although it's been shrunk, it has broadly the same sectarian apportionment that the previous government had. The Shia parties have 52% of ministries when they had 53% before. The Sunni parties have 21% of cabinet positions when they had 23% before. And the Kurdish parties, in fact, have 17% when they had 16% before. When you look at what Abadi said about judicial reform, he actually said, I'll give it to the judges to reform. And indeed, the judges are identified as the main source of corruption. And then when we look back into Iraqi history, we see that there have been protests like this all the way through the summers that preceded Abadi's taking over the premiership. And indeed, anyone with a long sense of memory, or indeed somewhat of an obsession with Iraqi politics like me, will remember that when Nouri al-Maliki a few years ago was faced with exactly the same demonstrations at exactly the same time, he launched, I think, a 100-day reform campaign in the middle of August that lasted until the weather got cooler, the demonstrations demobilized, and he could get on with governing. Which brings us to my last section of the talk with a couple of minutes, with the tolerance of the chair with a couple of minutes that's left. What is the future of Iraq? Indeed, what is the future of Iraq and Syria? What is the future of the region that is now, that region which is now beset with a series of failed states, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen? Overall, I think there's little doubt, in my mind at least, that the appointment of Haider al-Abadi was a positive thing. And indeed, Haider al-Abadi himself, I think, has tried to make a series of positive moves. I would hope, unlike his predecessor, that if he was sitting in the audience, that he would agree with a lot that I've said. But Abadi is in a very weak and vulnerable position. He has little or no military left, and the defense of Baghdad and the fight against Daesh is primarily driven forward by a series of militias closely aligned to Iran, motivated by sectarian ideology, and who have been undoubtedly involved in population movement and sectarian violence as they've liberated the populations that were previously dominated by Daesh. He is indeed, I think his legitimacy, shaky at the beginning, is declining because people like Hadi al-Amri are touring the country saying, look, we have defended you from Daesh, not him. And I think more depressingly than that, if we look at popular currents, both in the Sunni and the Shia sections of society, we find the arguments about partition, the arguments about separately, smaller, more religiously coherent states becoming more and more dominant, more and more accepted. The taboo about pulling Iraq apart, I think, has been dropped. Now, lots of pundits would say, and dance up and down, say, we told you so, this is the end of the supposed Sykes-Picot agreements that divided up the Middle East. Putting aside the rank historical illiteracy of that, it wasn't the Sykes-Picot agreement that actually set up the states of the Middle East. That's a historical point, but we could get to that if you wanted. It negates the ups and downs, the development of the institutions of the Middle Eastern states, specifically Iraq, and I think even more powerfully Syria, that did at certain times gain legitimacy from their populations. And if you look at all the opinion poll data from 2003 through to today, you still find a majority of Iraqis backing a unitary Iraqi state with Baghdad as its capital. So we're faced with a conundrum now. There is undoubtedly a political move towards talking about partition, but still the majority of Iraqis have still got fond memories and hopes invested in the reconstruction of the Iraqi state. How do we square that circle? Well, on one level, we see the United Nations, indeed, the diplomats in Baghdad working to try and persuade, to try and force, to try and push Iraqi politicians to reconstruct the civil institutions of the state, to reconnect with their populations. On another level, we do indeed have, albeit a very weak Prime Minister, al-Abadi, who agrees with that, who is trying to pursue that. But stacked against them, we have a war-weary and traumatized population. We have a political system that is corrupt to its core and is disassociated from the populations because the elections previously have been run on sectarian ideology that deliberately solidifies vote banks by ignoring the delivery of government services, bread and butter issues. I think my only hope is to look at the provincial election results from 2005 onwards, where we've seen a continual clearing out of provincial councils, where politicians don't, if they don't deliver, and they haven't delivered to their populations, they're kicked out of office because at the provincial level, sectarian politics play a much reduced role. So from that point of view, what Abadi announced in his inaugural prime ministerial tour, the decentralization of power back to the provinces, the re-empowering of provincial governors might just help the Iraqi state to survive and deliver politics back to a level where ordinary voters can have something at stake in the state, some investment of hope in the state can regain its legitimacy and therefore be worth fighting for. Thank you very much.
Toby, thank you very much. That was fantastic. You invited somebody to return to the question of who lost Iraq, and I would return to it only. I would invite you to comment on it only if it leads you to say something that you feel you can say something about, the scope of outside powers, and particularly the major outside power, by which I actually don't mean Iran, although maybe I should, to address the issues of legitimacy that you've been talking about.
Yes, as you know, there is an ongoing debate around who lost Iraq, both in the Beltway in Congress amongst the politically aware and active residents of Washington, and it plays out also in a lot of historiography of Iraq. there has been some excellent books on Iraq, about that thick, but the last 2 chapters are about bloodletting around the argument about who lost Iraq. I'm pretty clear about who lost Iraq. Indeed, I've published in numerous articles in an excellent journal called Survival making this case. The point is that a lot of the structural flaws that I've identified were built into the Iraqi system when American occupation was at its peak. Now, you could argue that the surge led by David Petraeus attempted to overcome some of those mistakes. But I think the American military is very good at killing people, but it's not very good at finding political solutions. And I think the political solutions identified weren't acted upon. As with Iraq and Afghanistan, the civilian surge never seemed quite to arrive and have the same transformative effect as the military surge. And so that leaves political issues dangling, and it leaves the underlying symptoms there. Now that, for me, and indeed the controversial Status of Forces agreement was negotiated in the dying year or so of George Bush's presidency, where he wanted, his ambition was to put Iraq on a stable basis, Iraqi-American relations on a stable basis that would be sustainable after he left office. It was that Status of Forces agreement that drove American troops out of Iraq. The rather late attempt to renegotiate it from anyone who had any idea about Iraqi politics was always doomed to failure, because both Nouri al-Maliki and indeed Muqtada al-Sadr said it had to go through parliament and there would never be a majority for that. So I think it's pretty obvious the main problems that have driven Iraq back into trouble, and indeed the Iraqi-American treaty that allowed for the exit of American troops, were all negotiated not under this administration but the previous one. And this administration largely managed that reduction. Now, we could talk about Syrian policy and where Iraqi policy should go as far as the US is concerned now, but to a certain extent, that who's going to lose Iraq and Syria now, not who lost Iraq before.
Well, the follow-on question, which may emerge in the open discussion, is what there is to win at this point, and particularly from U.S. policy. But let me open it up to the floor. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for an excellent talk. My name's Tarek York.
Oh, yes, please wait for the mic.
Thank you. My name's Tarek York. I work for the Cabinet Office. Could I ask a question? How do you characterize ISIS, Daesh? Is it a state? And if so, is it as unified a state with a unified approach across all of the territory it holds? It appears to be quite strong in parts of Syria that it controls, perhaps less of a state, more of an insurgency in parts of Iraq, and then there's the international dimension. Does it hold these sort of characteristics of a state you'd expect, with a working bureaucracy, some form of constitutional basis? Thank you.
That's a fascinating question. I was trained as a political scientist, and the question you asked me, what is a state, underlying that, many thousands of words and hours of classroom teaching and careers have been built on, to some extent my own. The answer is yes and no. Daesh in Syria, as you indicate, has a governing structure. Well, Daesh across the whole of the territory that it controls has a governing structure. It's more coherent in Syria, that's right. It administers, delivers some basic needs to the populations that it has dominion over in Syria. That's undoubtedly that. Rather worryingly, it's recently developed an international office to project campaigns overseas, coming to our shores soon, if not already. So it has objectives, and then of course you've got this duality between it seizing territory, as its predecessor, the Islamic State, did in Iraq at the height of the civil war, making it very vulnerable. Bang! Here we've got a return address and a target. But by declaring a caliphate in a propaganda coup, it triggered, in a small minority, I suspect, of largely young and alienated people who happen to be Muslims in Europe, a hope. And come join the 5-star jihad was the kind of slogan that after the seizure of Mosul. So if I was being technical, I'd say yes, in parts of Syria it has the workings of so it has territory, it has admin, it clearly has monopoly over the collective use of violence. But that does make it vulnerable, and it's a balancing act between whether the international community chooses to deploy the resources to denude it of its territory against the huge propaganda coup it gained by calling that state a caliphate. In terms of historical studies of Islamic civilizations, that's a nonsense, but the propaganda coup was immense. So, Yani Nusnus in Arabic, it's partly a state, but a very fluid, nascent one. I can't see it consolidating much beyond the territory that it's got.
Yes. And do please identify yourself.
James Roberts from the Tablet Catholic paper. Can I ask you about the Iran nuclear deal and the thinking behind that, and how this impinges on the excellent talk you just gave? Because would you say that the US is hoping that Iran will now be a major force, not only in countering ISIS, but also in bringing some sort of coherence to Iraq? How much Iranian influence in Iraq are we now supposed to tolerate?
Well, excellent, thank you. Your question rather cleverly has three aspects to it, so I'll answer it in turn. I think the Iran nuclear deal is a triumph of extended diplomatic negotiation, and I think it's a triumph in counter-proliferation. And if it sticks, if the Iranians abide by it, if the stick is left on the table with the carrot, it will stop Iran proliferating for 10 years, and hurrah for that, I think. But obviously, the inference of your question is there are other issues. I think there is, you're correct. I've witnessed it and heard it myself. An optimism at the highest level of the United States government. The Iran nuclear deal heralds a diplomatic opening to Iran, where Iran's interests with the United States can be collectively harnessed, and Iran can do some of the stabilization the United States doesn't. Let me be clear about that. I think that's absolute and utter and dangerous poppycock. The idea that a state, Iran and its revolutionary guard, that if not caused, accelerated and recommended the sectarian policies, but in both Syria and Iraq can be part of the solution, strikes me as absolute wishful thinking. I think that's crazy. And if we then pull it out to the region, and we ask what will the Iran nuclear deal do for regional stability, precious little. It's the quote that anyone's heard who's been to Saudi Arabia: if they remove the machine gun from my head and they replace it with a pistol, what difference does it make? I think Iran's ability to exploit the existing faults in governance, whether it was Lebanon, Iraq, or the Gulf, is noted, and I think that won't go away and may well accelerate. We're in a regional Cold War that speaks to Iran's desire for hegemony. If it can't realize, it won't now realize that through proliferation. I see no evidence that it won't try to realize that through propaganda and covert action, and it will have more money now to do that.
Yes. Second row.
Hi, Donara Boroyan, Albany Associates. I'd like to ask about Russia's deepening commitment to Syria and how will that affect the fight against ISIS? Thank you.
Great, another complex question with a series of answers. I think if we start general and get specific, clearly the Russians were enraged by what they saw as the breaking of promises or the mendacity around the intervention in Libya. And I think if we were looking for a watershed moment about intervention, about international intervention into civil wars in the Middle East, the Libya resolution would be that, I think, and that carries through. Secondly, Russia sees Syria as an ally, and an ally that it's clearly increasing its commitment to. And thirdly, and I wouldn't invest huge amounts, but it's certainly a fact, that Russia has its own idea of how you sort out civil wars, not in its own territory or its region of influence, but in other people's territory, and that involves negotiation, the move towards some form of coalition government. And I think we've seen over the last week, it may be too early to tell, but I think we've seen a ratcheting up of commitment around those issues. That means Russia will become overtly and centrally a player in the Syrian civil war because of its international its international aims, certainly because of its ally in Syria, and I think that's a profound issue. Now, the optimists are in a room and say, but now they've committed, they'll have more influence, and then we can move towards a negotiated settlement which will involve Assad and his immediate family moving to a comfortable retirement on the Black Sea, another man with a moustache who can control what's left of the government forces being brought in, and then the political process being opened up. That sounds like a credible road towards a settlement. I'm not sure how committed the Russians would be to that, to be frank.
Yes, right there. Towards the back.
Hi, my name is Kamil from Kayhan. After the long icon that said that Qasem Soleimani being celebrity in the media, he's come back to Iran and there is no fighting by leading Qasem Soleimani. What do you think? Is it based on an Iranian relation from the government? Is Rouhani roles that's taking back Soleimani in Tehran, or is other issue that it's Soleimani, there's no role in Iraq right now?
Well, I suppose the question, and you know more about this than me, goes to the division at the center of the Iranian state. The division born of the revolution between the Vilayat al-Faqih and broadly a parliamentary democracy, and the way that the power and policy making swings between both, reaching its nadir under Ahmadinejad, I suppose, and the repression of the Green Movement. And I'm not sure, to be honest, where we are now. Rouhani and Zarif are clearly trying to use international success to consolidate and expand influence at home, and we can only celebrate that, but where does that leave the covert extraterritorial forces of Iran? I've said before, I think that leaves them largely at the moment unconstrained. And there's a great argument. Well, there's two arguments there. Qasem Soleimani works for the government, which undoubtedly I think he does. People I know who've met him say he's by instinct on the reformist side. If he is, I've seen no evidence of that elsewhere, but fingers crossed. So I think Iran is in a really interesting place, and you'd be right to speculate about whether it could go, and this is the gamble that the Obama administration has put on the table, that it can be integrated into the regional international system, completely jettison its revolutionary, transnational hopes and become a paid up and responsible member of international society. Great if it can. I just see no evidence in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon or Bahrain of that happening at the moment, or indeed recently in Kuwait. So let's watch this space and hope they're right.
Yes, the gentleman 3 rows from the back, yes.
Thanks very much, Toby. Jeremy Wright from the Ministry of Defense. You've set out very clearly the political background to the current difficulties in Iraq. Again, accepting that political background, is there an alternative for the coalition beyond backing Abadi as having his instincts in the right place and taking him forward while holding the military position? Thank you.
The short answer would probably be no. There is no alternative. I think Abadi is the best prime minister that Iraq has had since regime change, which isn't saying a great deal, I admit it. I think his public relations campaign has been rather nimble-footed and right. I've met him a few times. I think that speaks to the man as well as his advisors and whatever nationality they may be. But he has little or no power. So, and again, in terms of diplomatic UN, NGO, INGO policy in Iraq, Baghdad, they're rallying around with possibly greater diplomatic coherence than there's been in the past, and trying to do exactly that, bolster the man, and encourage the recohering of Iraq's civil institutions. What are the chances of success of that, given that the military is so weak, the power on the streets is dominated by Iranian-backed sectarian Shia militias, and Abadi's own legitimacy, for very understandable reasons, is shaky? It wouldn't be a rational thing to bet on him being there for his full term. I would, just out of optimism and hope, but we'll see.
Yes, in the back row.
Yeah, hi, member here, member Rusi. It's been a very interesting talk, but something that's been omitted is who's backing ISIS, who's supplying them. There's no mention of Saudi Arabia, the Qatar, the Gulf states, and there's no mention of how the Americans allowed them all to congregate in Camp Buka, where they radicalized each other for the last few years. And going back to Andrew Parker's talk today, we have the same situation happening in Belmarsh and Long Lartin, and it's all very well to discuss academic theories and should do this and should do that, but in practicality, you have to look at how it happened, who let it happen, and who's funding it. You can't let diplomatic niceties get in the way of a portion of blame where the blame should go to.
Very frank, so there's no attempt, so there's no ambiguity about what I've said. I thought I was being rather practical, obviously I was being too obscure. There is no evidence whatsoever that I have seen in open sources and from people who I know who have close sources that Daesh has had any state funding from anyone. No, but also I've not come across anyone who has access to close sources who's made that argument. There are a lot of swirling conspiracy theories, but I've not seen them confirmed or in any persuasive way. Now, I have seen a lot of really detailed, interesting reporting from the UN, amongst others, that have down to as closely as possible, explained in great detail where they got their finances from. And I think that's very, very persuasive, and there is no hidden hand. It's rather disappointing, I grant you, but they have done it through antiquity smuggling from Syria, through seizing the oil fields around Raqqa, and rather ironically, through seizing vast amounts of armaments supplied by the United States to the Iraqi army, who for good reason, but rather disappointingly, ran away when confronted with a much smaller force. So I think where they get their money from is fairly explainable. Where they've got their weapons from is explainable. Who's to blame? I think I would also, as I think, if I didn't make clear enough, I think the United States policies from 2003, possibly up to 2011, are to blame. I think Nouri al-Maliki in driving forward a sectarian agenda is also to blame. I think also depressing. I think the regional situation is to blame as well. But depressingly, this is the next stage in the development of Islamic radicalism. And as I mentioned in the talk itself, the Islamic theology and philosophy is fairly minimal. The sectarianism rises up in a very aggressive way. And that's why I would say that Daesh was born in the hard-scrabble villages and towns of Anbar when that population was being persecuted by the Iraqi government. I think there's no hidden secret there. What I'm having difficulty with, and I'll freely admit it, is the practical question to the answer, what do you do? But having advised governments over most of my career, having spent quite a bit of time in Iraq in 2007 and 8, I'm a little bit skeptical about magic bullets and military cures to what is ultimately a political problem.
I think the argument that's usually put is that with sufficient military force, you can provide the umbrella to inculcate the political solution, but that's what you would also reject.
Yeah, let me answer that, because American power in Iraq reached its pinnacle, what, about 8 months, 12 months after the surge that started in February 2007. So American military power, the Bush administration, to the detriment of its campaign in Afghanistan, threw everything it had at Iraq. To be in Baghdad in 2007 and 8 was to see the pinnacle of American power in terms of signal intelligence, the very brave soldiers fighting on the ground, their ability to target and to apprehend large numbers of both the Islamic radicals and the Shia militias. What they didn't have the ability to do then, under that umbrella of a huge muscular military commitment and very great sacrifice, was to change the political territory, the political terrain upon which the Iraqi state was functioning. That's why I'm very skeptical when people say political solutions follow military victory. They didn't in Iraq.
Second row, right here.
Thank you, Professor George, for an excellent presentation. I'm Kiran Hassan from SOAS. My question is regarding ISIS or Daesh's footprint in South Asia. Could you comment upon that, please? Because do you think a kind of increased footprint in South Asia, countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan, Bangladesh, or so what's the future there? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks to the IISS's thriving and very active South Asia program, I know much more about this than I would ordinarily. Let me step back and answer that question generally. You have if you look at Al-Qaeda's franchising program, it was incredibly successful, but also born of the camps of the Afghan campaign against the Soviets and then the Afghan jihad. So you had a camp alumni that then spread it out. I think Daesh's, if I may be so bold, international strategy, its franchising strategy, started almost as a second-order interest, and that its remarkable spread was more through demonstration effect and success. That was the first argument. But the second argument that it's come to, as international recruits have come to it, it's been forced to become, and also as the international community has come to it in terms of the US-led air campaign, it's forced to have become more international. And the great fear, I suspect, of those people who work in policy and intelligence is that those internationals now in Mosul and Raqqa are leading the re-exportation of Daesh's model, certainly to South Asia, but I think it's Afghanistan and Pakistan, it was more by demonstration of success to begin with, worryingly to Europe as well. So I think it's late to the international game, but that alumni is so much bigger, so much easier to get to, so many more will, I think, be wreaking havoc across the world for many years to come, whatever the fate of the caliphate itself.
Well, we're out of time. I'll take, if you can be very brief, just two more. The gentleman in the fifth row, if I'm counting correctly. Yes. And you. I'll take these questions together, if that's okay, Toby.
Thank you. Just a word, please, on the prospect of Kurdish independence in Iraq.
Prospect of
Kurdish independence.
Aha, okay, that's great.
Good question. Thanks. And in the very front row.
Member of the Institute, Tim Verity. What chance would ISIS might have come about if the Americans had not invaded? Would there still have been, you talked about scrabbling around the villages, would there still have been an impetus for this to come about in a different way at a different time, perhaps? What would your view on that? Thank you.
Yeah, that strikes me as an extremely fair question.
Yeah,
because you know, much of the argument is that the American invasion just set off forces that otherwise would have remained dormant forever.
Right. Firstly, on the KRG, Kurdish Regional Government's quest for independence. Now, of course, the KRG has pursued an independent oil policy, has struck some much more financially advantageous deals with increasingly large multinational oil companies. And the great problem was how that oil would be got to market in financially feasible ways. Its opening of its pipeline through Turkey, obviously at mercy of the rather shifting policy of Erdogan's government towards the Kurds, gave it that. And of course then with the collapse of the Iraqi army, estimates would suggest that in the summer of last year the KRG increased its territory by 45% and took over the Kirkuk oil field. So it took the disputed territories and it took some rather major real estate, and it took it by the power of the sword, which is now moving quickly to legitimize. Now, against that background, the answer is, does that make independence more or less likely? I would argue it probably does make independence more likely, and I think it will come, but it will be dependent on three things. Firstly, as ever, the regional powers. I think Kobani, I watched with fascination and a deal of honest befuddlement the Ankara's policy towards the KRG, because I'm sitting there saying, you have an internal Kurdish problem. You have a Kurdish problem being rocket-fueled in Syria, and yet for reasons of regional geopolitics, basically to beat Nuri al-Maliki, you're encouraging or flirting with Kurdish independence. Why on earth are you doing that? Surely you can see the contagion effects. And I think Kobani may have been watershed where finally they recognise the contagion effect or were confronted with the ramifications of it and their own ending of the negotiations ceasefire with the PKK. So the Turkish issue is still going. Of course, the Iranian issue about the Kurds is highly problematic. The second thing is the coherence of the KRG itself. Now, clearly, if it's the joke that Ronald Reagan told Jimmy Carter, that Jimmy Carter obviously in the presidential election campaign was much younger than Ronald Reagan, but all the debate was about Jimmy Carter's age.
Ronald Reagan's age.
No, it was all about Jimmy Carter.
That was the joke, yes.
Yeah, he collapsed during the jogging and everything. And so Ronald Reagan rang him up and said, I always ride an older horse. And people are meant to laugh, that didn't work. The point being that if you are the KRG and you sit next to Iraq, Syria, or Iran, you look like a paragon of democracy and internal state coherence. I'm not going to tell that joke again. Anyway, the problem being that, as we know, there's a constitutional crisis at the moment because President Barzani won't have an election and he won't leave office. So what is the status of Kurdish democracy? And of course, after they seized their 45% and the Kirkuk oil wells, Barzani then once again said, right, we're going to have a referendum about independence. So, hey, we've got it now, which he says frequently. And then Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi decided to move towards Erbil, which had two effects. It showed that the myth of the brave Peshmerga, who hadn't actually been militarily active against another fighting force since 91, they'd grown literally in a lot of cases fat and old, and they weren't a particularly effective fighting force, but also the KRG, for its much vaunted sovereignty and independence, was dependent on the international community. So that puts so that's the third thing. But the second thing, internal coherence. I think the third thing is relations, obviously, with Baghdad. The oil deal, the deal that they have in Baghdad, the weakest, but also the most pro-KRG government they've had for years. I mean, Adel Abdul Mahdi is oil minister. Adel is the biggest and most extended friends of the KRG, and yet still they can't get a viable, workable oil deal. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us, I think, both sides have got their interests and their rationale and their balance between short and medium-term gains wrong. And I think, should we gently say that the KRG is badly advised and suffers from hubris? And I think we see that going forward. So I think they will gain independence. I think just within a regional context, they are coherent, and the repression and faulty democracy and the corruption that dominates the KRG isn't rampant and is constrained, which makes them look a lot better than their neighbours. But they've still got a long way to go in negotiating with their neighbours, especially Turkey, in getting their own house in order and trying to work out where an economically sustainable independence will come from. The final question, which is a counterfactual and was a particularly sneaky one. The answer probably is no. We have the rise of a new phase of Salafist Islamic jihadism across the whole region. And if Daesh hadn't launched a hostile takeover of the Syrian civil war, and there's an argument raging about how US policy has encouraged or disencouraged the Syrian civil war, but clearly the Americans aren't to blame for the Syrian civil war, and I think you would have seen in Jabhat al-Nusra a harsh, aggressive, active Islamist movement. I think what the US invasion of Iraq did was fertilize, supercharge, and send out into the world Daesh. And so it sped up this next phase in an austere and incredibly violent jihadism. It would have taken longer, but it wouldn't have laid dormant, I don't think.
Thank you, Toby. Well, you had a huge turnout, and I venture to guess that no one's been disappointed. So I hope they'll join me in thanking you for
but
an
I want to know
presentation.